You ever seen a grown woman in a power suit scale a locked ranch gate in heels while screaming something about a clubhouse and historic community rights? That was my Thursday morning, and to make it better she had brought a film crew. I kid you not, a local HOA president named Karen, and yes, that was her real name, tried to force her way onto my family ranch because she believed it belonged to the neighborhood despite every legal document proving otherwise. She actually believed that if she yelled loud enough at my fence, it would sign the deed over itself. Meanwhile, I was sipping black coffee watching from the porch as my goat Daisy chewed on her scarf. Through the bars of the gate her camera guy just kept filming like this was some kind of real estate reality show. It wasn't, it was war. It had all started just a week earlier with what looked like a friendly visit. I was fixing the tractor near the front shed when a shiny SUV pulled up in a cloud of perfume and pretension. A woman in pearls heels and a perfectly pressed blazer stepped out carrying a wicker basket that looked more like a bribe than a welcome gift. She introduced herself as Karen Monroe, president of the Green Trails HOA. She smiled with teeth too white to be sincere and handed me the basket full of lavender soap, cookies, and some brochures that said, "A Vision for the Future Clubhouse Expansion, 2025. I should have thrown it back in the SUV, but I was raised better than that. I told her thanks and asked what she needed. She got straight to the point, said the community needed more space for events and wellness activities, and my ranch was perfect for it. She suggested buying the back 6 acres. I smiled, told her politely that this ranch had been in my family for nearly a century, and we weren't looking to sell. She nodded like she understood, but I saw the flicker in her eyes. It was the same look coyotes get before they lunge. 2 days later a new sign appeared near the edge of my eastern fence. It said future site of community clubhouse pending approval. I thought it was a prank until I checked county filings. Karen had actually submitted a construction proposal that included several acres of my ranch, as if she already owned it. According to her paperwork, I was listed as a pending cooperative seller, which is fancy talk for liar. I drove down to the HOA office in town, demanded to speak to someone with a functioning brain, and was told Karen was in a meeting. I waited an hour, then left her a very clear message on the back of one of her brochures in permanent marker. I wrote "Not for sale" in 10-inch letters and taped it to her glass door. The next morning my water pump mysteriously stopped working. I checked the lines. They had been deliberately shut off at the roadside valve box. That box sits outside my fence near the public path. The lock was gone, and the shut-off valve had been turned with a tool, not a hand. I knew who did it. I couldn't prove it yet, but I knew, and that night when I installed a motion-activated camera pointed at the road, I made sure it had night vision and audio. A few days passed, then came round 2. Karen didn't show up herself this time. She sent a man in a reflective vest, who said he was doing a routine survey for utility alignment. I asked for ID. He didn't have any. I asked what company he worked for. He muttered something about subcontractors. I asked why he was marking trees 50 feet inside my fence. He bolted into the brush and vanished like a cartoon character. I found 3 trees with bright orange flags and tiny red spray-painted numbers all pointing toward the fence line. That's when I knew this wasn't going to end with words. I started collecting documentation, saved every county record, every email, and printed a fresh copy of my land deed. Then I went down to visit Judge Hastings, a retired zoning lawyer who lived 2 miles down the road. He looked at my paperwork, laughed, and said I should install a moat. I said I already had one. We just call it a creek. Judge Hastings told me that HOAs like Green Trails often overstep when they think no one will fight back, but they messed with the wrong rancher. He offered to quietly advise me and handed me a binder of old HOA meeting notes someone had leaked to him. It showed that Karen had already promised the land to several board members for personal project space. One wanted a wine-tasting patio, another wanted yoga bungalows, and Karen herself had written a note saying VIP event center with private bar and bridal dressing suite. Meanwhile, Karen tried charm again. She dropped off another basket. This one had cupcakes shaped like houses. The note said, "Let's not make this ugly. You'd be doing the community a favor." I took the basket, walked it right back to the HOA office, and left it on their toilet tank. By now the neighborhood had started buzzing. Some supported her, but most were confused. People didn't realize my ranch wasn't part of the HOA. I'd refused to join it when the subdivision was built 20 years ago. Back then they begged me to sell. I refused. Now they were just turning back to old habits, only this time with paperwork and pushy egos. I thought about my granddad, who built the barn with his bare hands, about the old cottonwood trees planted by my mother, the pasture where my kids used to play when they were toddlers. I wasn't selling this land for any clubhouse, not for $1 million, and especially not to a woman who tried to manipulate and threaten her way through life. And so the next time she showed up at my gate screaming about legal obligations and property reassignment, I just waved from the porch and turned up my radio. The goats didn't mind the noise. Daisy even posed for a selfie with a local news van parked nearby. She didn't know it yet, but the more noise she made, the more the world would find out exactly who Karen Monroe was, and trust me, the world was about to tune in. The morning after Karen's meltdown at my gate, I drove down to the county records office with a folder thick enough to slam shut a bank vault. I wasn't going there to argue or speculate. I needed to see for myself if this woman had really gone off the deep end, or if she'd taken a bulldozer with her. The clerk at the desk, an older woman with a badge that read Cheryl, looked up as I stepped in and raised an eyebrow like she already knew what I was about to ask. I said the name Karen Monroe, and she sighed before I could finish the sentence. She handed me a file with a yellow sticky note on it that said urgent and whispered, "You're the ranch owner, aren't you?" I nodded, and she rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. Inside the file was everything I feared and more. Not only had Karen submitted a detailed blueprint of the future clubhouse grounds, but the entire design was labeled as Phase 2 of a community expansion plan. What chilled me was the fact that over a third of the layout was drawn directly onto my property. Trees I had planted, a barn my grandfather had built, even the corner well that still pulled water after all these years. It was all casually reimagined as a patio, walking trail, and something called a VIP gazebo. And worst of all, right there on the cover page, it listed me as a conditionally cooperative contributor, which was the most backhanded lie I'd seen in years. I stormed back to my truck, scanning the documents again. She wasn't just making a move. She was building a narrative that I had already agreed, or at least was in talks, that gave her leverage to pressure the board, the county, and even new buyers into believing it was all inevitable. I wasn't just being nudged, I was being erased. I knew I couldn't let that stand, but I also knew better than to show all my cards at once. That night, just as the sun dipped behind the hills and the frogs started their chorus, a pickup rolled up to the edge of the property. I was sitting on the porch stringing barbed wire when I spotted the flicker of a vest under the dim headlights. Another man with a clipboard got out and started poking near the fence line. I walked up slowly and asked what he was doing. He claimed he was a utilities subcontractor checking water main placement. I asked for ID. He hesitated. That's when I saw it, the HOA badge hanging from his belt loop, half hidden. I took a step closer, and he backed off, muttering that he had the wrong location. I watched him leave and made a mental note to move the game camera to a higher angle. The next morning I reviewed the camera footage and found something better than a blurry face. I had audio. The man had called someone on speaker and said, "Yeah, I'm marking the trees on the north side. Tell Karen she better have the permits by Friday or it's gonna look suspicious." That was the break I needed. I copied the footage to 3 flash drives, mailed one to my lawyer cousin, dropped another with Judge Hastings, and kept the third for insurance. By the end of the week, I had more visits than a diner on Sunday. A group of HOA board members came by pretending it was a routine inspection of boundary clarification. I didn't even let them pass the gate. One guy named Dennis tried to talk over the others, saying this was just standard procedure, nothing hostile. I asked him if standard procedure always involved trespassing and fake documentation. He turned red, then pale. I told them to get off my land and not come back unless they had a sheriff with them. They left without another word. I thought that might slow them down. I was wrong. 2 nights later, someone snuck onto the ranch and tried to pull the survey stakes I had placed myself along the southern edge. They didn't know I had added new motion lights. As soon as the first one lit up, they panicked and ran straight into a fresh patch of manure I had dumped earlier that day. Whoever it was left behind a brand new hammer, some gloves, and a half-buried tape measure. I handed it all to the sheriff the next morning. He shook his head and muttered, "These HOA people are losing their damn minds." That weekend, I got a visit I wasn't expecting. A young woman named Leah came by, said she was a newly elected HOA board member and didn't agree with what Karen was doing. She looked nervous, kept glancing over her shoulder like someone might be watching her. She told me in a hushed voice that Karen had already signed contracts with a landscaping firm and a construction company, conditional on land acquisition. She also told me something that made my blood run cold. Karen had claimed in a board meeting that if I didn't cooperate, she had ways of convincing him to see reason. Leah didn't know what that meant, but she said several members were starting to question her leadership. I thanked her for coming and told her to be careful. People like Karen don't take betrayal lightly, especially from their own side. The next morning, I called in a favor from a buddy of mine who worked at the county planning office. He dug a little deeper into the permits and found a few irregularities, specifically a line item labeled External Amenities Zone with no legal address listed. It was a placeholder, which meant the permit hadn't been approved yet but was filed in anticipation of ownership change. That was enough to file a formal complaint, which I did the same afternoon. I also contacted a local news anchor I knew from high school and sent her a redacted version of the HOA blueprints and the camera footage. She said it sounded like the kind of story that could stir up some real noise. That was the goal. If Karen wanted to play dirty and quietly strong-arm me into giving up my land, I was going to flip on the stadium lights and broadcast it to every person within a 100-mile radius. Later that night, as I sat on the porch watching lightning crawl across the horizon, I realized something that made me smirk. Karen had made one fatal mistake. She assumed that just because I was quiet, just because I lived off a dirt road with goats and tractors and worn jeans, I wouldn't fight back. But I wasn't just fighting for land. I was fighting for legacy, for truth, for every inch my family had sweated over for generations. And I wasn't going to let some HOA tyrant with a clipboard and a bottle of Chardonnay take that away without one hell of a storm. It started just after sunrise on a Tuesday. I had just finished feeding the goats and was walking back to the barn with a bucket of feed when I heard the low rumble of diesel engines that didn't belong to any of my machines. At first, I thought maybe the neighbor was getting gravel delivered again, but when I rounded the corner, I froze. 2 yellow bulldozers and a dump truck were idling at the eastern boundary of my ranch, right outside the fence. 3 men in hard hats were pacing back and forth with clipboards like they were surveying a job site. And then I saw her. Karen, standing in heels and a reflective vest that looked like it was bought just for the photo op, barking orders like she owned the place. She had a printed map in her hands and was pointing at my barn, as if it were a shed to be cleared for some fancy HOA garden. I walked straight over to the gate, heart pounding, trying to keep my voice steady. Before I even said a word, Karen turned to me with a smile that could curdle milk and said, "We're just getting a head start on preparing the soil. You'll be compensated fairly, of course." I blinked, confused and furious. She actually believed this was happening. I told her in no uncertain terms that she was trespassing, and those machines had no business being anywhere near my fence. She waved me off like I was a mosquito, and said the HOA's legal team had cleared it. I told her I had my deed in my house, the sheriff on speed dial, and that unless she moved her equipment in the next 10 minutes, she'd be seeing him again, this time with charges. What Karen didn't know was that just last week I had met with the sheriff about this very possibility. He had already warned his deputies that the HOA was pushing their luck. So when I called him and said the bulldozers had arrived, he didn't hesitate. 20 minutes later, 3 patrol cars rolled up, lights flashing. The sheriff himself got out and walked over to the site. He asked to see Karen's permit. She presented a stack of papers that looked official but weren't signed by any authorized county official. The sheriff read the top page and frowned. He turned to her and said, "Ma'am, this is a zoning application, not an approved permit. This doesn't give you the right to break ground on someone else's land." Karen's face turned pink, then red, then purple. She shouted that the land was going to be part of the HOA eventually, and that the community needed it. The sheriff calmly told her that, eventually, wasn't today and that she had 5 minutes to clear out her machines before citations were issued. She looked like she might explode. The construction crew, realizing things were above their pay grade, quietly packed up their equipment and backed off the property. Karen, steaming with rage, promised I'd hear from her lawyer. I smiled and told her to make sure they brought snacks to court because it would be a long day. But that wasn't the end. That night, I decided it was time to hit back. Not with threats or lawsuits, but with something much more entertaining. The HOA was holding a Clubhouse preview day that weekend, a community event meant to show off their big dreams and convince homeowners to support the expansion. They were setting up tables, food trucks, and a stage. It was happening at the edge of the subdivision, right near my property line. So I decided to send a few of my most reliable ranch hands to crash the party. Not people, goat. On the morning of the event, I opened the back pasture gate and let about 30 goats wander down toward the festivities. They trotted in like parade floats, nibbling grass and meandering toward the smell of funnel cake and barbecue. People screamed. Children laughed. One goat climbed on a folding chair and knocked over the dessert table. Another chewed through a decorative ribbon. And right in the middle of it all, Karen was on stage with a microphone, giving a speech about vision and progress and community enrichment. A goat named Biscuit walked right up and yanked the cue cards from her hand, chewing them mid-sentence. It was beautiful chaos. The whole thing was caught on video by multiple neighbors. One clip showed Karen swatting at Biscuit with her clipboard while yelling, "Get out of here, you dirty animal," which would have been fine except a news crew was filming a segment nearby and caught the entire tantrum. Another video showed a goat chewing on the wiring of a speaker system, causing a loud pop and static that sent Karen tumbling off the back of the stage in a moment that was equal parts humiliating and viral gold. Within hours, the footage was online. Titles like "Goat Attacks HOA President" and "Karen Gets KO'd by Community Chaos" were trending. Karen's polished image as a respectable community leader was unraveling faster than a ball of yarn in a kitten cage. The HOA board, which had been hesitant to challenge her before, suddenly had the ammunition they needed to start pushing back. I heard whispers from a few insiders that they were planning a vote to remove her from the presidency. Later that evening, while cleaning up the pasture, I got a call from Judge Hastings. He told me the footage had reached the county zoning board. Apparently, they were investigating Karen's misuse of HOA authority and reviewing her permit filings for potential fraud. It was one thing to be a nuisance. It was another to fabricate legal status and misrepresent land ownership in official document. If the investigation found anything concrete, Karen wouldn't just lose her position, she could face real legal consequences. I went to bed that night more relaxed than I had in weeks. But I wasn't naive. Karen wasn't the kind of person to take a loss quietly. She would double down. She always did. And sure enough, the next morning, I found a bright pink envelope taped to my mailbox. Inside was a letter from the HOA's legal representative accusing me of interfering with a sanctioned community event and intentionally releasing livestock onto public space. It was so absurd I almost laughed. The letter ended with a threat of civil action unless I agreed to meet for mediation. I set the letter down and poured myself another cup of coffee. Karen had tried everything: bribes, lies, machinery, and now lawsuit. But what she still didn't understand was that I wasn't defending a patch of dirt. I was defending legacy, truth, and everything this land represented. She wanted a clubhouse. I wanted justice. And I wasn't going anywhere. It was the middle of the week when Karen launched what she probably thought was her final, brilliant maneuver. An email blast went out from the HOA office with a bold headline written in capital letters that said Emergency Town Hall regarding dangerous neighbor obstructing community progress. I received 6 forwarded copies from residents who thought it was a joke. According to the email, the HOA was hosting an emergency public meeting to discuss what they claimed were safety concerns, property expansion rights, and the unwillingness of a neighboring landowner to act in the interest of public welfare. They didn't say my name, but they didn't have to. The entire neighborhood knew exactly who she meant. The town hall was scheduled for Thursday night at the community center. By the time I arrived, the parking lot was already overflowing, and people were standing on the sidewalk with folding chairs and lawn stools. Some were clearly there for drama, others out of real concern, but nearly everyone had heard about the goat incident, the bulldozer standoff, or the video of Karen falling off the HOA stage like it was a circus act. I took a seat in the back wearing my worn ranch hat and flannel, arms crossed, saying nothing. I wanted to hear how far she'd go with her lies. Karen took the podium like she was campaigning for public office. She had a stack of papers, a slideshow, and a smug expression that suggested she still believed she had full control. She started by reciting her version of recent events, conveniently omitting the bulldozers, fake permits, and her uninvited surveying crews. Instead, she painted herself as a visionary, someone who had only tried to improve the community, but had been blocked by what she called an isolated and unreasonable landowner who refuses to cooperate for the greater good. People around me started murmuring. A few shook their heads. Then she made it worse. She claimed the presence of livestock near the HOA boundary had created a health hazard. That's when someone near the front stood up and shouted, "Lady, your clubhouse isn't even real yet. How can something be a health hazard next to nothing?" The room erupted into scattered laughter. Karen's face twitched, but she kept going, insisting that the land had always been intended for communal use, and that she had uncovered historical paperwork, suggesting it once served as public access property. I nearly choked. She was trying to rewrite history now. Then came her grand finale. She played a video clip on the projector, edited footage of the goat incident, but carefully trimmed to make it look like I had intentionally disrupted the HOA event to cause harm. She added dramatic music and slow-motion effects of Biscuit chewing her speech cards, like it was some kind of premeditated sabotage. The absurdity of it would have been hilarious if it wasn't being presented as evidence in front of hundreds of people. Just as Karen paused for her expected applause, the door at the back of the room opened. In walked Leah, the same board member who had warned me weeks earlier. She was holding a flash drive in her hand and whispered something to the guy running the projector. He looked confused but plugged it in. The screen flickered. Then came a new video, one Karen hadn't seen. It started with her on a phone call, pacing near the HOA office. Her voice was clear. She was talking to someone about the construction crew, laughing about how the ranch owner had no clue what's coming. Then another clip played where she said, "If he doesn't move out of the way, we'll bury him in legal paperwork until he gives up." The audience went quiet. Karen froze. Then the final clip played, her voice again, saying, "We'll turn that pasture into a bridal suite if it kills him. I already ordered the furniture." The silence turned to gasps, then murmurs, then scattered applause. The projector shut off. Karen was still standing at the front, mouth open like she had just swallowed a fly. Leah walked forward and calmly said, "The HOA board never approved these statements or these actions. We were not informed of the full extent of President Monroe's personal plans. We apologize to the community for the chaos." What followed was chaos of a different kind. One by one, residents started standing and shouting questions. Who gave her the right to do this? Who's paying for these lawsuits? Why weren't we told about the land permits? Karen tried to regain control, but the crowd wasn't listening anymore. Her own supporters were backing away. I didn't say a word. I just watched it happen. The board called an immediate vote of no confidence. There were a few procedural motions, some shouting, and Karen demanding her right to speak, but it didn't matter. The board voted 6-1 to remove her as HOA President effective immediately. The one vote in her favor was her own. As she was escorted out by 2 HOA security volunteers, she screamed that the community was ungrateful, that I was a fraud, that everyone would regret this. Nobody followed her. Someone actually booed. After the meeting, I was approached by several homeowners who offered apologies, handshakes, even homemade pies as peace offerings. Some were ashamed they hadn't spoken up earlier. Others just said thank you. I told them I never wanted a war. I just wanted to be left alone. But when someone comes for your land and your name with lies, you don't just walk away. You stand. Later that night, I sat on my porch under a sky full of stars, listening to the wind rustle through the grass like an old lullaby. I thought about everything Karen had done, every step she'd taken to try and erase what my family built. And I thought about how quickly it had all unraveled when the truth finally had a stage of its own. It wasn't over just yet. I knew she'd try one more move. People like Karen don't vanish. They scheme. But this time, she'd be working without her board, without her title, and without the protection of silence. She had tried to paint herself as a hero in a battle no one asked for. And in the end, it was her own voice that brought the whole story crashing down. The calm that followed Karen's public downfall didn't last long. Just when the neighborhood began settling into the relief of a leaderless HOA, another envelope appeared in my mailbox, this time delivered by a private courier wearing a cheap suit and a smug grin. It was thick, overly stapled, and screamed legal theatrics. Inside was a letter from Karen's personal attorney threatening me with a civil lawsuit for emotional distress, public defamation, and malicious interference with HOA business. According to the document, I had orchestrated a targeted campaign of humiliation and psychological harm, all because I had refused to sell my land. Reading it was like opening a comedy script where every punchline was unearned outrage. I almost laughed, but I knew better. This was her last stand. She had no board, no title, and no community support, but she still had money and lawyers, and that made her dangerous in a whole new way. I forwarded the documents to my cousin Alan, who practiced law 2 towns over and already had a file named HOA Circus in his system. He reviewed the claims and told me they were flimsy at best, ridiculous at worst, but still needed to be handled carefully. People like Karen didn't sue to win. They sued to exhaust. They threw enough paperwork at you until you gave in or slipped up. But I wasn't new to hard work, and I wasn't about to fold just because someone printed bold letters on legal stationery. So I called in favors, gathered my evidence, and prepped for a court showdown. The case moved fast. Karen had insisted on an expedited hearing, hoping to catch me unprepared. But that only made it easier to dismantle her narrative. In the courtroom, she arrived wearing a somber black dress and sunglasses like she was auditioning for a courtroom drama. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue, claimed I had sent wild animals into her event with malicious intent, that I encouraged public mockery, and that I trespassed on the HOA's emotional space. Yes, she actually said emotional space. The judge, an older woman who looked like she'd been sitting through petty squabbles for 3 decades, asked Karen to clarify what emotional space meant in legal terms. Karen faltered, mumbled something about psychological territory, and earned a deadpan stare in return. My cousin Alan stood up, calm and ready. He presented video evidence, emails, zoning maps, and even the audio of Karen planning her little land grab operation. We had the permit filings with forged designations, the HOA meeting minutes showing the board had not approved her actions, and even the footage of Karen herself saying she'd bury me in paperwork if I didn't comply. The judge listened patiently and asked very few questions. When Karen's lawyer tried to argue that I had weaponized goats, the judge raised an eyebrow and said, "Are you suggesting he trained them to chew her speech cards?" The case was dismissed before lunch. The judge ruled that Karen's suit was retaliatory and frivolous. But she didn't stop there. She issued a strong warning that any further attempts to pursue similar legal action without merit would be met with sanctions. Karen stood frozen, her expression one of disbelief and disbelief's angry cousin, indignation. As we exited the courtroom, she turned to me and hissed that this wasn't over. I told her she was right. It wasn't, because now it was my turn. The very next day, my cousin filed a countersuit for defamation, trespassing, attempted land fraud, and damages relating to property interference. It wasn't about revenge. It was about setting the record straight and showing people like Karen that consequences weren't just a theory. She had crossed too many lines, disrupted my life, and endangered my property. The damages weren't just emotional, they were measurable. And this time, the law was on my side. As the suit made its way through the system, something unexpected happened. Several members of the former HOA board came forward and offered statements. They admitted to being manipulated by Karen, pressured into silence, and excluded from key decisions. One of them turned over internal emails where Karen had written, "Once the ranch is ours, I want the bridal gazebo installed by spring." That became Exhibit A in my case. Months later, the court ruled in my favor. Karen was ordered to pay damages, issue a public apology, and cease any future interference with my property. The apology had to be delivered via recorded video and published in the HOA's monthly newsletter. I wasn't expecting sincerity, and I didn't get it, but watching Karen sit stiffly in front of a camera and read words she clearly hated was the kind of satisfaction no money could match. Her voice was flat as she admitted to overstepping boundaries, misrepresenting authority, and making inappropriate decisions without board approval. It wasn't heartfelt, but it was binding. With her influence completely shattered and her finances hit by legal fees and the judgment, Karen quietly moved out of the community. Rumor had it she relocated to a gated retirement neighborhood in Florida. Someone sent me a screenshot of her new HOA's welcome announcement. It listed her as a resident but not on any committee. Maybe she finally learned her lesson. Maybe not. But she was gone, and that was enough. As for my ranch, it stayed exactly the way it had always been: sprawling fields, lazy goats, the barn my grandfather built, and the old windmill creaking in the wind. But something did change. After everything that had happened, the community around me became closer. People who once barely nodded my way now waved, stopped by to chat, brought homemade bread and stories. They apologized for staying silent or falling for Karen's charm. I didn't blame them. People get swept up in false promises all the time. What mattered was that they saw through it in the end. A few months later, I decided to give a small part of the back pasture to a local animal rescue group. They needed a quiet space for rehabilitation, and I had the room. It wasn't a clubhouse, and it sure wasn't a VIP bridal suite, but it was something real, something good. The same goat who had chewed up Karen's speech cards ended up becoming the face of their fundraiser campaign. They even named the event Biscuit's Bash. The photo of Biscuit wearing a tiny sheriff badge and sunglasses ended up on t-shirt. It sold out in a week. Every now and then, I get asked if I'll ever sell part of the ranch. I always give the same answer. This land isn't just property. It's history, roots, sweat, and stories. And no clubhouse, no angry letter, no HOA queen with a clipboard will ever change that. Sometimes I sit on my porch, drink in hand, watching the sun dip below the hills while the goats wander through the pasture. I think about how far Karen went to try and take something that was never hers, and I smile knowing that when push came to shove, it wasn't the HOA or the meetings or even the lawsuits that beat her. It was the truth. Relentless, stubborn truth. And a few determined goats.